Okay, hello and welcome everybody. This is the fourth talk in the autumn session of PHO2, the joint research seminar of the Center for Philosophical Studies of History and the Center for the Philosophy of Historiography. My name is Georg Gangl and I will be today's moderator. More importantly, today's speaker will be Fons Dewulf with the topic Reading in Historiography and Iterative Measurement, Atheism, Forgery, Cannibalism and Deification. Fons is assistant professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, which makes him into our first speaker from Asia, and which also means it's very late for him. So we are doubly grateful for him being here. I think it's 8 or 9 o'clock at night for him. Fons' main research interests lie in the philosophy of history, the philosophy of science, logical empiricism, and the respective histories of those fields. Of Fons' many publications, I only want to mention two recent ones here. This year only, he published the paper Disciplinary Bounds and the Upkeep, a framework to capture 20th century philosophy in its context, which came out in the journal Hoppos. And in 2022, he published Beyond Hempel, Reframing the Debate About Scientific Explanation, which was published in Philosophy of Science. For Fons' many other publications, I would like to refer you to his very well-kept homepage, where you also find a blog, which is very interesting to read as well. Especially, there's a very interesting article about how Gustav Hempel nearly died on a bike ride in 1930s. I can recommend this very much. And the others, of course, too. Then after today, we will still have one more event in our autumn seminar. On 28th of January of next year, Hermann Paul from the University of Leiden will be speaking about epistemic success in historical studies, truth, truthfulness, and truer than. And then, of course, we are now already planning our spring seminar. So if you would like to speak in our spring seminar, you want to see somebody really speak in our spring seminar, please let us know. To stay updated about all our information and all our events, consider following our social media of both centers. We do this seminar series, but we do also a lot of other events and we have publications and such things. Now, very shortly on technicalities, please mute yourself during the talk to avoid any unnecessary disturbance. After the talk, there will be a discussion session that I will moderate. The talk should take around 45 minutes. In the discussion session, if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, please raise your digital hand. I will make a speakers list. When it's your turn, you can either speak up with or without your camera on or write your question in the chat, and then I will read it out loud. And we will prioritize people who haven't spoken yet. Okay, that was already for me. Thank you again, Fons, for being here, especially so late. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, thank you also for the invitation. It's been a while that I've spoken specifically for an audience of philosophers of history. So it's a nice occasion for me. Let me share the PowerPoint. Yes, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So Georg mentioned that I have sort of a varied interest, and in a way, I am a philosopher. I was trained as a philosopher, I should say. I was also trained as a philologist, ancient Greek philologist, and in my academic journey, as it were, I sort of more and more became an intellectual historian, more than a philosopher of science. Even though I like to do philosophy of science, I actually teach philosophy of science, but I don't publish that much in it. I publish a lot about it, but from a historical point of view. I've done a lot of archive research, and recently I've also done a lot of oral history of philosophy of science, and yeah, at some point I wanted to stop being an intellectual historian and become more of a philosopher again in my research, and this talk sort of is my attempt at doing this in a way. And my big question, I think that's the question really that started me in my academic journey, is what are we doing when we are investigating history, intellectual history, especially? What is it exactly that we do in our researching? And if you want to answer that question, there are two routes in a way. You can sort of overthink it, make it very complex, the story about what we are doing when we're doing history. And you can also be very obvious, stating the obvious. And so then you're very uninteresting. And of course, the challenge, I think, is to be right in between, to say something that is close to a description of what it is that you're doing when you're doing history, but at the same time, still being philosophically interesting. And that's very hard to do. And I'm trying my best today. I hope to do my best to get in between overthinking and being uninteresting. And I want to start with a couple of interesting examples, some of which that I will go into a little bit more detail later. So here we have a text published in 1532, Pantagruel, which is the first novel of a French novelist, François Rabelais, actually a doctor at the time. And this novel became one of the crucial topics for the historian, the French intellectual historian Lucien Febvre, in the 80 years ago. And why was Febvre interested in this novel? Because people claimed that in this novel you can read it and see that its author is an atheist, is defending certain atheists' worldviews, certain atheists' beliefs. And Febvre wrote an entire book why this is not the case, why the author, François Rabelais, is not an atheist. Very crucial case, a very famous case study, really, of how do we, or how can we use a text, in this case a novel, to ascertain something about beliefs of people who have died 600 or 500 years ago. So this is a picture of François Rabelais, and this is the book by Lucien Febvre, The Problem of Unbelief in the 16th Century, which is a fantastic book. A second book that I want to highlight here is another very, very good case study. It's a book by a German author, again of around 1546. The German author is Hans Staden. He is a sea captain. He was a Landsknecht who went to the Americas and came back and produced this wahrhaftige Historia und Beschreibung einer Landschaft der wilden, naakten und grimmigen Menschenfressenleugner in der Amerikas gelegen. So a true story of these wild, naked, man-eating peoples. And this is again a very famous case. Can we use this as a source for cannibalism in the Brazilian areas in the 16th century? Staden claims that the Brazilian tribes eat people. Can we take his word for granted? So here, these are some nice pictures that Staden himself drew for his novel. So I say novel, but it's supposed to be a true historical account. Another very famous case is, of course, the death of Captain Cook, here depicted by John Webber, who was an eyewitness to the event. And here you see Captain Cook with the cap on. He is the last person on the island, and he is about to be killed by the Hawaiian people. And this is a very famous case because there's a lot of debate, and there has been a lot of debate over whether Cook was deified or was not deified by the Hawaiians when he arrived on the island of Hawaii. And the only way we can solve this mystery is really, again, by going back to certain texts, in this case, handwritten accounts of the events by those who survived it. And of course, they're always only English accounts. We do not have written accounts by the Hawaiians. Now, another case, very similar here again, one that I will talk about is Lorenzo Valla, 15th century humanist, who writes an oration or a declamatio, a declamation on the donation of Constantine. And he says that this is a forgery, and this is what he calls a mendacious publication. So the donation of Constantine is a document that supposedly was written in the 4th century, in the early 4th century, and that attests to the fact that Emperor Constantine grants the Western Roman Empire to the Pope Sylvester in this case. And here you see a picture of one of the manuscripts, one of the, I think, 9th century manuscripts that actually survived of this donation of Constantine. And it is these manuscripts that Lorenzo Valla is discussing in his Declamatio. And of course, Valla claims that these manuscripts were not written in the 4th century and could not have been written in the 4th century. Now, all these cases, they have something in common, and I think this is one of the crucial questions to answer if you're thinking about historiography, is how do we transform a text into evidence for a historical claim about what happened? And of course, texts are not the only types of sources and types of evidence that historians use, but they are definitely, especially for human history, the most important source, or one of the most important sources. And you could say in general that this question is core business for all scholars in the humanities. This is definitely not something that is exclusive to history. And also in my own field, the history of philosophy of science, well, there are certain things, of course, here that are similar. So I've written myself about this book. This is one of the books that is the most important books in history of philosophy of science in the 20th century, The Logical Construction of the World by Rudolf Carnap. And nowadays, today, I think nobody in the field will claim that this book defends a version of classical sense data empiricism. And this is interesting because clearly we can come to an agreement about what a text represents. And in this case, whether based on this text, we can claim that Rudolf Carnap is defending a certain philosophical position. And this in itself, I think, is an interesting epistemological phenomenon that we can come to an agreement, a very broad consensus on how to transform texts into evidence for certain positions about beliefs, events in the past. And really, this is my topic. Now, one way you could look at it, how this is done, is in this way, where you have a variety of texts. And these texts then can all sort of support theories. And then you can say, okay, there is this one text here, the black text, that also supports A, B, and C are not supported by this text. And so theory A wins. And in a way, in this sense, you could say that these texts, that we can measure how much support a text gives to a theory. And if you buy into this paradigm, you really get into very similar questions as the ones in traditional philosophy of science about confirmation. What is the degree of confirmation of a theory by certain texts? And I think that this is not an interesting way to think about it. And so one way to describe this is a form of evidential holism, the idea that the total system of our beliefs about the past faces our textual evidence at the same time, and that any new piece of evidence can warrant a change in our historical theory. This is a very Quinean way to think about historical evidence, textual evidence. But what exactly is the evidential relation between text and theories? So in this picture, this is very obscure how to really think about it. And is it really the case that any new text that sort of pops up can warrant a change in our historical theory? Like, is that a good way to think about it? And of course, today I will claim that it is not. So let's go to the last case that I presented, the donation of Constantine. And I said that one of the manuscripts that is left of the donation, also of the texts where the this donation is being described. You can see it here. Well, this text is very complex. There are actually various ways in which we can think of this text. So first, of course, there is the text as the material object, a manuscript or a typescript. Then there is the text as a reconstructed object. And so you have to, from the material object itself, you sort of have to reconstruct what the text is. What are the letters? What are the words? What is the ordering? What are the passages that follow one another? And the result sort of is a critical edition, of course, of this text, a symbolic representation of the script in the text. Then there is, of course, the text as the interpreted object, a theory about the content of this text. And this is something that you can easily overlook because we often take this for granted, but this is not something that we can take for granted. Whether a text is a forgery, a fiction, a report, this in and of itself is a theoretical idea about this text. And so this is another layer that adds complexity. And then fourthly, there's also the question, okay, what can we infer from the interpreted object to the historical theory? So even if we provide an interpretation of the text, then we can still ask the question, okay, now what does this text, or what is this text evidence of? And this is the question of the evidential relation. So you could say that the relation between text and historical theory is inferentially complex, because you need to take into account all these different layers of what the text is. Now, I want to make a comparison between these historical texts and actually observations and experimentations in the natural sciences. And I would actually claim that the complexity of texts is very similar to the complexity of experimentation and observation in the sciences. So here on the left, you see a representation, a pictorial representation of Robert Boyle's air pump, again, a famous case, of course, from the history of science. And then on the right, you have some of the first, well, they're not thermometers yet, they are called thermoscopes, that were produced in the 1630s in the Accademia dei Lincei in Firenze. And so the interesting thing about these cases is that here we can see as well that the experiments being performed with these objects, well, that first and foremost, we point out that these are particular material objects being produced by agents with the material that they have at hand. And then there is the layer of how the concrete experiments and observations being produced through this material represent something else. The people producing these objects have an idea of how they function, how they should be operated on. But there is, of course, always a difference between how someone actually uses an object like a thermoscope or an air pump and how one wants to use it. For instance, in the case of the air pump, very famously, the seals are crucial. How the seals are being manipulated. And you have to reapply the seals every time you put something new into the air pump and have to pump the air out. And so there is the ideal, of course, that you apply these seals constantly, perfectly all the time. But in practice, this is not the case. And of course, the same with the thermoscopes. Crucial for the operation of a thermoscope is the consistency of, one of the things is the consistency, for instance, of the liquid inside. You want these liquids to be completely similar between these thermoscopes. But how do you guarantee this? Another aspect, of course, is that an experiment has to be interpreted. You have to produce from your sort of common sense observation, for instance, of the level of a liquid at which button or dot it stands. You have to say, okay, this stance of the liquid at this point in the flask, what does that represent? How can we represent it, for instance, on a scale? And so an experiment also needs to be interpreted much like a text has to be interpreted. And then, of course, there is the additional question, okay, what can we infer from the measurement or the observation outcome to the theory? This should be to the theory. So what is the evidential relation? So the complexity that we have in historical texts is definitely present in observation and experimentation, also in the natural sciences. Now, before I continue with this comparison, there is an important point I think that I want to make here, and it's a point I think that doesn't really exist yet in the literature, and that what we call epistemic objects, that they are two things. So you can think about an epistemic object as the object that scientific thinking is about. So then, in the case of the air pump and the thermometer, that would be temperature, air, or space. These are instruments which we use to grasp these objects that are part of a much broader scientific theory. But there is also a second sense of an epistemic object, and that is the object because of which we can have knowledge. And so in these cases, that would be the thermometer or the air pump as a physical thing that we can create, and because of which we can have knowledge about temperature, air, or space, for instance. And a text, I think, also has these two layers, and I'll come back to this in a moment. Yeah. So in the case of a text, the epistemic object would not be the text necessarily itself, but the event, whether or not the donation of the Western Roman Empire to the Pope took place. And then the object because of which we can have knowledge about this would be the text of the donation of the Constantine. So a text really is an epistemic object in the second sense. So it is an object because of which we can have knowledge. And in this way, I think that a text used by a historian really is very similar to an instrument produced by a scientist, an instrument like a thermometer and an air pump. Now, there is a lot of theory, of course, already about scientific experiments and scientific measurements. And let me produce one more classic example, the example of the scale, an object that allows you to equalize amounts of material to express comparative ratios of a material. A scale is very useful in a way. It's perhaps one of the first epistemic objects produced by mankind. It comes in various shapes and forms. You not only have scales that use the balance, the principle of the balance, but you also have scales that use certain electrical resistances to measure weight in this case. And of course, the scale has all kinds of cultural meaning as well attached to it. It is one of the oldest epistemic objects, I think, in existence. Now, about a scale, interesting here, there's always the concrete scale, the object that you are using to perform the measurement, a particular balance scale, a particular electronic scale, and there's always in the background an abstract scale. The theoretical conditions that you think have to be instantiated into the concrete scale. And these theoretical conditions, they tell you under which conditions the scale functions or malfunctions. And the very idea of a balance scale, the very idea of an electronic scale. And this concrete and this abstract aspect of epistemic objects is always there. This is, of course, an idea that's not mine. It's Pierre Duhem's idea that an experiment in physics is the precise observation of phenomena accompanied by an interpretation of these phenomena. And this interpretation substitutes for the concrete data really gathered by observation, abstract and symbolic representations which correspond to them by virtue of the theories admitted by the observer. And I think this is something that historians and humanists in general should take to heart, is that interpretation is also, of course, crucial in physics, for instance, and is not too dissimilar from interpretations of texts. Okay, so I've been talking about epistemic objects in the second sense, the objects because of which we can have knowledge, and they always entail both concrete instantiations used to perform an epistemic activity, and then, of course, always an abstract ideal used to perform an epistemic activity. So they are always matter and form. They are always matter and theory. Now, scientific progress, if you take this to heart, then scientific progress really entails two things. First and foremost, improvements to the material setups involved, being able to manipulate your material setup such that it can instantiate your theoretical idea of the setup. And in the case of, for instance, the thermometer, this was an enormous challenge, of course. But also at the same time, often what is going on is there are improvements to the theoretical interpretation of the epistemic object's function. And these go hand in hand. And of course, again, this is not a unique idea that I have. This is really, I think, the main idea that is being presented in Ha-Seok Chang's famous book, Inventing Temperature. This idea that there is epistemic iteration going on at both levels, both at the concrete and the abstract level of measurement in science. And I think this is a good description as well of Chang's general agenda, namely to ascribe scientific progress to an intellectual field is at least partially to ascribe improvements to the history of the epistemic objects which make that field possible. And so part of, for instance, thermodynamics, of course, the fact that we have a field of thermodynamics, this is only possible because we have an epistemic object like a thermometer. Now, understanding ourselves as progressing agents also means that we understand that history. And with that history, I mean the history of the epistemic objects that make a field possible. And producing such historical understanding, and this is something that Chang really, I think, takes to heart as well, that producing this historical understanding is a necessary condition for making progress itself. Often the best epistemic agents are the agents that understand how the history of their own field has progressed. This is, of course, also, I think, a big agenda behind Dynamics of Reason by Michael Friedman, and I will be talking a little bit more about Friedman and Chang as well. Now, but before I go a little bit further, crucially, of course, is that neither Friedman nor Chang ever applied their ideas about scientific reasoning and scientific progress to the humanities. And in a way, I think this is a shame, and I think there is much to be gained in doing this. Now, Michael Friedman has a clear idea about what it means to write a history of science in such a way that we can see that science progresses. This is a bit of the later Friedman in 2012. He says, just as experimental practice is governed by an ideal of universal communicability based on the demand for replication, abstract mathematics is guided by a parallel but distinct such ideal based on the demand for rigorous proof. And our confidence in the possibility of truly universal intersubjective agreement in both cases does not rest, as Kant thought, on antecedently shared cognitive faculties necessarily common to all human beings at all times and places, but simply on our historical experience of the extent to which these two particular human enterprises can in fact approximate to this ideal. And for Friedman, it is clear that the history of scientific reasoning is a history of certain epistemic desires. And the crucial epistemic desire that Friedman thinks is central to science as we know it is the ideal of universal intersubjective agreement. And Also, Chang talks about epistemic desires actually a lot. In the case of thermometry, there is the desire for comparability, that if you place a thermometer in Hong Kong and you place one in Brussels, one says 10 degrees and another says 10 degrees, that these 10 degrees are the same 10 degrees. There is the desire for uniformity, the idea that there is a uniform temperature scale that spans across all types of thermometers. And nowadays we take this for granted, that if you have a thermometer, a classical liquid thermometer, and you have a different type of thermometer, that they will be uniform, that they will be comparable. We take this for granted. But of course, this was not for granted and could not be taken for granted at the very beginning. Now, crucially, according to Chang, these two desires, they are actually expressed in a principle, which he calls an epistemic or metaphysical principle of single value. And this is the idea that any physical magnitude that is being measured can only have one value. And according to Chang, this is a principle that is fundamental for thermometry as such. Now, I want to summarize this Chang-Friedmanian account and say that certain epistemic desires are expressed in epistemic principles, and epistemic principles are constitutive of epistemic objects. So you have, for instance, the desire for comparability, the desire for uniformity. These are expressed in principles like the principle of single value, and then using these principles, we can come to create certain epistemic objects that then drive our theorizing and our experimentation further forward. Now, it seems that I've been talking about measurement, thermometry, especially, seems far removed from history, but I think it is not. And I think we need to produce, this is of course an old philosophical agenda, but we need to go back to it. We need to produce an account of history such that it really becomes a science again. We need to rethink how history as a practice is very similar actually to the natural sciences, and I think physics especially. Now, there are, of course, available histories of the humanities, histories of historiography out there. This is one I think that it's very good to read, Rens Bot. I won't be reading the quote, but the idea behind Rens Bot's book is not to show that history or historiography is epistemically similar to the natural sciences. No, Bot wants to say that the humanities can also have a return on investment. That is Bot's main idea. We value the natural sciences because they have a return on investment, and the humanities also have a return on investment. And Bot is, of course, Dutch, so getting a return on your investment is very important. And I'm not against this message per se. But I think that philosophically there is much more to say. Another idea that you find, for instance, histories of the humanities is in Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve, where Greenblatt wants to sort of value humanistic studies in the Renaissance because they are the origin point for modern science. So Greenblatt is someone who claims, look, the humanities are great because, well, without the humanities, there would not have been such a thing as modern science. And again, this is, I think, epistemically a weak story to tell about the humanities. There is a much more interesting, much more strong story to tell about humanities. And in a way, I want to tell it. That's something that I think drives my interests here. I want to say that the humanities are epistemically similar to the natural sciences. And I think similar is even too weak. They are epistemically the same. It's not that there are similarities. No, fundamentally they are the same. But of course, how can you argue for this? Can you produce a history and philosophy of historical reasoning as though it is scientific reasoning, not as though it is like scientific reasoning? No, as though it is scientific reasoning. And crucial part of Michael Friedman's account is this idea idea that scientific reasoning is characterized by the overarching fundamental epistemic desire of universal intersubjective agreement, which is then expressed in the ideal of universal communicability, the ideal of rigorous proof, and that, of course, these ideals cannot be applied to the humanities, or cannot be applied so easily. But I think if you look at it, well, universal agreement, there is definitely universal agreement on some level. So in the 4 cases that I presented, on the left, you find Lorenzo Valla's claim that the donation is a forgery, that the Roman emperor never donated part of his empire to the Pope. And there is universal agreement on this. So there is nobody who really questions this. And also at the time, really, it did not take that long before people no longer questioned this. Of course, in the case of whether Rabelais was an atheist or not, so this is the case of Lucien Febvre, well, there is still a little bit of disagreement. But by and large, since Febvre wrote his book, I think no one will claim that it is an easy case to make that Rabelais is an atheist. So there is not universal agreement, but there is a good consensus. Now, in the case of Cook and in the case of Hans Staden's account of cannibalism in Brazil, well, these are a lot more contentious. But there is a spread between full consensus and heated debate. And I think focusing on, okay, where there is consensus, what is going on? How is it that we have used these texts to create this consensus? And I've earlier said that the relation between text and narrative or historical theory is inferentially complex, but I think that this is not a good way to say it. Complexity is really a buzzword. No, it is, I think, inferentially asymmetrical. And there is fundamentally something interesting inferentially going on between texts and theory that we need to take into account. There are parts of historical theory whose change cannot be purely warranted by textual evidence. And I think that this is a fundamental, not only, I think this is a fundamental aspect of historical textual research practice. And I think this is also, if you want to really get a good defense of this, you should read Michael Friedman. But I think that this is also, this asymmetry is also part of the natural sciences. Now, a crucial question is, of course, the question that I started with: how do we use texts for our historical theories to assess or to warrant those historical theories? Well, the traditional way in which the donation of Constantine case is presented is, okay, we read the manuscript. We read the manuscript of the donation of Constantine and we see that it makes use of concepts like satrapies and optimates to describe office holders, so political office holders in the 4th century in the Roman Empire. And to support read is a matter, of course, of transforming the manuscript that you find into a reconstructed text. And this in itself is already not easy. Reading, being able to actually read 9th century manuscripts is a skill in and of its own right. And then you have a second premise, which I will call the conceptual space premise, that satrapies and optimates are not part of the conceptual space for legal Roman documents in the 4th century. And then you conclude that, therefore, the donation of Constantine cannot be a document written in the 4th century. But there is a problem here. The problem is that the support that you can give for your conceptual space premise is not independent of your reading of the donation of Constantine and of your assessment of the conclusion here of F. In a way, if you say that if you take this conceptual space principle for granted, then de facto always the donation of Constantine must be a forgery. And so a way to say this is that the conjunction of the conceptual space premise and the conclusion does not face the trial of experience symmetrically. And let me explain this a bit further. So suppose you have these 6 texts, 5 of them A to E, they all align with the conceptual space principle, that satrapies and optimates, that they're not part of the conceptual space of the 4th century Roman Empire. And then you have another text, text F, that goes against this idea. Now, purely based on formal logic, you have 2 options, and they're equally valid. So from the point of view of formal logic, these options are equally valid. Either you just give up your conceptual space principle, or you say that the outlier is mendacious, and so that the outlier wasn't written in the 4th century. And logically, these are of the same value. But of course, you have used your conceptual space principle to date and to judge A to E as well. And so this conceptual space principle is not empirically assailable, or at least not directly assailable by text F itself. And so I think that what is going on here is something that Ha-Seok Chang and Michael Friedman have called contingent transcendental principles or constitutive principles. So A is constitutive of B if and only if A is a presupposition for B's empirical justification. And A itself cannot be justified by empirical evidence. And the classical case is, of course, the case of the 3 laws of motion by Newton, which are a presupposition for the empirical, the possibility of empirical ascertainment of what movement is in space, and that these laws of motions cannot themselves be justified by empirical evidence. There's also a third condition, that A must be fully expressible in the available evidence. Now, according to Friedman and Chang, these constitutive principles must be vindicated. And they cannot be confirmed. No, they must be vindicated by their methodological role in achieving empirical knowledge of the world. And there is no universal general rule which can decide between these alternative constitutive principles. One's judgment of the history of the empirical research itself sort of is the justification. If you can say, well, using these principles, we have progressed our empirical research, well, then that is sort of a vindication of the principle. And so in the case of thermometry, this is how Chang sort of thinks about it. And so Chang says you have certain epistemic desires. They are expressed in these principles, and then these principles become constitutive of epistemic objects. And if we can say that in progressing in these iterations of our epistemic objects, that in these iterations our desires are properly expressed, then we can say that we have progressed. And so in assessing the successfulness of these principles, we should talk about vindication and not about confirmation. And I think this is the same with the donation of Constantine, for instance. So I think a fundamental desire that is being used by Valla, and I think by most historians in general, is sort of a fundamental desire for temporal uniformity. We want events to be ordered in one uniform linear timeline. What happened later cannot have had an effect on what happened before. This is a desire that is being expressed in a fundamental principle for reading historical texts, and that is the actors categories principle. And what this principle is, I will go into detail a little bit later, but fundamentally, it's the idea that an actor cannot use a concept that an actor does not know. And then, of course, these principles are constitutive of our epistemic objects, of our reading of these texts, like the donation of Constantine. And these principles, again, I think can only be vindicated. They cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed. Now, what is a principle like the anachronistic actors category. So if a concept X occurs in a text whose author did not know that concept, then we have two options. Either we say that the actor's concept is not concept X, so that actually the actor is using not what we think is the concept, but is using another concept. Its meaning is not the meaning we attribute to concept X. That's one option. Another option is to say that the provenance of the text is not correctly attributed, that the author is not, or that the author is not the author that we think it is. In the case of the donation of Constantine, for instance, the author, according to scholars today, the author of the donation of Constantine is a person who lives in the 9th century, not a person who lives in the 4th century. Now, crucially, this principle is not open to empirical refutation. And this is a crucial part of why it is a constitutive a priori principle. Suppose we find a text purporting to date from an era when actors did not know a particular concept. Should be concept, yes. According to the principle, this entails that either the meaning attribution or the actor attribution must change. There is no empirical counter instance you can give to this actors category principle. It is a rule of interpretation that simply constitutes investigative historical research. And I think I would say that basically this principle is an expression of a very fundamental epistemic desire that is part of what it means to do historical research. And this epistemic desire is temporal, the desire for temporal uniformity. So going back to this original argument for the donation of Constantine, you can say that Reed is still an empirical statement, but the conceptual space principle is a constitutive principle. It is basically an instantiation of the anachronistic actors categories principle. So in these two principles, so the major epistemic principle of the actors categories principle and then the concrete instantiation of it, together they allow us to order texts in time and use that ordering to track conceptual developments within an intellectual linguistic culture to a great degree. And we cannot confirm these principles. No, we must vindicate these principles through our historical research itself. Now, I have a similar argument to make about Rabelais and how to read and think about Lucien Febvre's book, but I won't be going into that because we are lacking a bit of time. So I'll skip that. But I do want to go into a quote by Febvre that is crucially interesting, where Febvre says that the problem for the historian is not a problem of the poverty of the sources. He says, let us not say if only the texts were richer, the witnesses more loquacious, the confessions more detailed. At this point, the problem becomes clearer and at the same time narrower. The problem is not for the historian at any rate to catch hold of a man, a writer of the 16th century in isolation from his contemporaries, and just because a certain passage in its work fits in with the direction of one of our own modes of feeling, to decide that he fits under the rubrics we use today for classifying those who do or do not think like us in matters of religion. The problem is to determine what set of precautions to take, what rules to follow in order to avoid the worst sins of all, the sins that cannot be forgiven, and that is anachronism. And I think it's interesting to read that according to Febvre, anachronism is sort of a historical sin. It is, if you are a historian, then it is your fundamental desire to avoid anachronism. And so I think that basically in historical research in general, this fundamental epistemic desire really is epistemically driving much of the research. Okay, I'll also skip this. I'll wrap up. So Lorenzo Valla did his work in the 15th century, and he definitely used some version of the conceptual space principle that I attributed to him, and some version of the anachronistics actors categories principle. However, there is not much empirical success at this moment based on these two principles. There is sort of a promise of a research program. And a lot of what Valla is doing in his own analysis is still very closely akin to rhetoric, something that we today would definitely not associate with science or professional historiography. And I think by the 19th century, however, you find still these principles being used to order texts, to order concepts. And by the 19th century, there is an enormous amount of empirical success already, and there is a massive research program. And I think a proper history sort of the humanities would be a history where these major empirical research programs of 19th century philology are set on a similar epistemic bar as sort of the major achievements in the 19th century, for instance, in astronomy. Now, I'll come to my conclusion. So the humanities, I wanted to say that humanities are epistemically the same as the natural sciences. And I think the crucial question is, can one produce a history and philosophy of historical reasoning as if it is scientific reasoning, as if it is the same scientific reasoning that we find in chemistry, in thermometry, in the natural sciences in general? And of course, in the natural sciences, there are clear overarching epistemic desires. For instance, the ideal of universal communicability, which is expressed in the desire for replication, and the ideal of rigorous proof, which is expressed in the mathematical language that is being used in scientific theories. And of course, replication, the idea of experimental replication, and the idea of mathematical expression of concepts cannot be exported to historiography. And that's not what I am trying to say. I'm trying to think, okay, how can we think about the overarching epistemic desires that are present in historiography and that actually have been extremely successful? And I think one of those fundamental epistemic desires is a desire for the absence of anachronism. But how are these desires expressed? And in which specific epistemic principles are they expressed? And I think that this is sort of a research agenda that I would like to develop further. And one of the crucial questions in that research agenda is, how important is the actors categories principle fundamentally in using historical texts using historical texts as evidence for historiographical theories? And I would like to develop and keep developing these ideas along these lines. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, thank you very much, Fons. That was a lot of interesting stuff, especially. I'm sure there will be quite a few questions. I would have some, but I first moderate. So who would like to go first? Please raise your hand in the chat, or your real hand. Okay, I see Avi's real hand. Avi, please go first.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So, basic thesis: the unity of science. Return to the old positivist project. So, what do you make? What do you make of the analysis of people like Carol Cleland, the debate with Dirk Turner, distinction between theoretical sciences and sciences of tokens and sciences of types? The claim that in the natural sciences, we're not interested in token events. If the experiment goes wrong, we just do another experiment. In historiography, we are stuck with one-time experiments. And then when you talk about conceptual spaces and desires, who cares about desires? What does it matter? I mean, it's not about desire, but it's about a community. It's not an individual desires. A community has certain interests. They start with their information theories. They approach information that reached the presence, interpret that interpretation according to those information theories. So it's not about some kind of conceptual design space. There is no such design space, arguably. There's just what is left of the past, and then we approach it with information theories and try and extract whatever information there remained. And that's not the problem that theoretical scientists have when they go to the laboratory, because if there's anything goes wrong in the laboratory, just discard it and then move on to and try another experiment, or try the same experiments in a new setting. Historians don't have this kind of luxury. So I think start just by locating yourself in relation to people like Carol Cleland and Derek Turner. Where do you agree or disagree with them?
So about the token type distinctions. So what I am arguing against, or what I am saying is that if we produce a philosophy of historiography, we should not focus too much on how the subject matter distinguishes itself from other fields. And of course, historians are interested in particular events. Scientists are not interested in particular events. They do not produce theories of particular events. And that is true. But epistemically, what we are doing, I think, is similar. And what we are doing is we are using empirical evidence to think about, to argue for certain theories. And these how we use that, how we produce that evidence, I think there is a lot of similarity. And epistemically, I think that's the main focus point for me. And of course, there are distinctions between historiography and other fields, but there are also a lot of distinctions between chemistry and physics and subparts of physics, if you purely look at the subject matter. So what I would say is we should stop looking at what distinguishes them based on subject matter and start looking at well, the epistemic procedures that we use. And this is not, so that's in a way you are absolutely right that I try to be a positivist. I try to be a good positivist. In this talk, I've tried to be a good positivist, and being a good positivist, it's very difficult. But
what do you mean by empirical in the historical sciences, and how do you distinguish yourself from Carol Cleland, let's say?
Well, so what I mean is I can't talk about Cleland because I don't know enough about it. But what I'm trying to say is that, okay, if we think epistemically that experiments and observations play this crucial role in how scientists provide warrant or support for their theories, well, then this is also what historians do. Experiments and observations in the natural sciences are not different from our use of texts. They are not. They were doing basically the same. All the complexities that you find in how an experiment is being set up, you can find in how we use texts. And I would also say, okay, historians, of course, cannot produce experiments.
Hello, Fons? I think you were gone shortly.
You were frozen.
You were shortly gone for 30 seconds or so. Maybe.
Okay, so what I was saying is that historians do reread texts in the same sense that scientists do rerun experiments, and so I don't think that that's very dissimilar. And your point about desires, yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right that this is a very contentious way for me to present things. So I think that at least for Ha-Seok Chang, this is very clear because he is a a pragmatist, so he thinks fundamentally that in epistemology, aims and desires are crucial because you cannot judge epistemic success if you do not have certain aims in the background. For Friedman, this is more contentious, but I think there is good. I would definitely be willing to say, okay, I can make a good textual case that this is present, and of course, this is not something. This is not something that's generally accepted. But I think that in a way, community, what makes a scientific community, I would again say, well, a community is a community because they are joined they have a joint desire. I think that is what is fundamental to a community. If a community lacks these epistemic desires, then they are not a community. So for me, that's how I would think about communities, but in their shared desires. And I think that Lefebvre, for instance, Lefebvre is right to say that what is fundamental if you are an intellectual historian, what is one fundamental desire that you have is you want to avoid the sin of anachronism. And that once you give up that fundamental desire, well, then sure, we can still talk to each other, but we can no longer talk to each other as intellectual historians.
What do you mean by anachronism?
That would be. Sorry.
What is your concept of anachronism?
We have a few more questions. Let's finish this still, and then we can come back to it if there's interest.
There are various ways in which you can produce it, but the way I explained it here, I would stand by it. So if an actor, let me bring up the text again. This one. So if a concept X occurs in a text whose author did not know that concept, then either the author's concept, the actor's concept is not the concept that we think it is, its meaning is not the meaning that we attribute it to it, or the provenance of the text is not correctly attributed. This is a principle, an anachronistic principle that we use. And if
cannot be a basic principle if you don't know. How do you know that the author knew or not knew the concept? My point, what I'm getting to, is that the primacy of the evidence, the primacy of the text. It's all about coherence between texts. It's not about what the author had in his head or not, because that's not primary. You don't know that. You cannot assume it.
Okay, answer this, please, Fons, if you want. And then we have to move on a few more questions, but we can come back of it, of course. We're not so many people today. If you wish, answer to this still, Fons. Or...
Well, so yeah, I think this principle always has to have or works together with instantiations of it, and yeah, I don't agree with the conception that what we want is purely coherence. You can create coherence in multiple ways, and so I think that this sort of principle it plays a role, an important role, because it sort of adjudicates how to think about coherence. It makes coherence into something. Well, it makes a very confused and multifarious idea of coherence into something more concrete. Yeah.
All right. Josie would be next, but David wrote in the chat that he might have to leave earlier, so I'm not sure if David is time pressed. Maybe he should go first, if Josie allows.
Yes, I allow.
Okay.
I allow.
Are you time pressed, David?
A little bit, but I was also expecting that my question can fall off if there is no time.
Well, go first if you're most time pressed. Please,
absolutely. When you are talking about anachronism, it seems that you identify distrust in historians, which is very similar to what Quentin Skinner is doing, I think, which is very, very, very visible. And Quentin Skinner is also vastly inspired by Collingwood, which was, I think, the debate we had in Groningen regarding your topic. But also my question about anachronism and usage of it. Like one thing is when what Skinner actually aims against, which is when historians understand some thinking of the agents anachronistically. That's one problem. And the second thing is when historians use anachronisms when they are describing something. Those are two distinct instances of anachronism. And for example, Skinner, who is always cited as a bigger opponent of anachronisms, is actually using anachronisms very openly when he's talking about Renaissance, when he's talking about stuff. So would you be willing to make that difference as well?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that you need to describe the past in terms that were available in the past. Like that's not what this principle is about. It's about attributing. But and here we start to. So that's why I think that we need more research on how anachronism is a fundamental desire and how it is expressed in these epistemic principles, because clearly it's not expressed uniformly and unilaterally in the same way all the time. So here in the way that I describe it, you mainly use it to this is a way in which Valla uses it, right? To date texts. This is in a way, so this is a way in which it is expressed for a very particular kind of epistemic activity, namely dating texts. But dating texts is important. So and I think for dating texts, this kind of principle is very fundamental. But there are various versions of it and various instantiations of it, and if you want me to produce a full theory, well, I really don't have it yet. And I think Skinner, what is interesting about Skinner is that he's certainly someone who picks up on this, but he like it's again, it doesn't really make things precise enough. And I think it's very challenging to make it more precise. And that's sort of the challenge that I want to take on. So this, what I present here and what I presented at Groningen, I've been thinking about this for 10 years now. And for the past 9 years and a half, I thought, well, I'm not there yet, so I shouldn't say anything about it. But then sort of you keep postponing and you end up being an intellectual historian. And then sort of I want to go back to the original ideas that drove me when I started in academia. And I think you're right that I'm not there yet. But Skinner is of course a main inspiration to me. Yes.
Thanks. So I think it's a great topic, and it's the right venue here to talk about this. It's all very relevant to the philosophy of history. So I would encourage you to keep on it. But next is Josie then, and then myself perhaps.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I on the phone and made a mess. I hopefully I can ask an intelligible questions. So thank you very much. It's very interesting. So what I was wondering, are you saying that there is the history of, say, humanistic history is similar to a kind of the history of science? So in some ways, historians of science proceed in the way in which historians do, because historians, I suppose, use what you call the principle of, anachronism is a sin, yeah? And in a way, historians of science have to do the same, because if you want to study the way in which people said things about temperature a long time ago, then you have to look at the instruments in the way in which somebody who studies Roman history has to look at what Roman law was like, yeah? So are you saying that there is a parallel between history as it is normally understood as like the history of the Roman Empire, the history of the Greek civilization, and the history of science, yeah? Or are you, and is that what it means to say that you're a good positivist? Or are you saying, on the other hand, that there is that history is a science, so that in a way there is no distinction between humanistic pursuits and scientific ones? Because it seems to me that the presuppositions while in a way one would have to carry the history of science, to do the history of science, as one is doing the history of the Roman Empire, you have to look at the theories that were adopted at the time in order to understand what sort of results the people got. Practicing scientists operate on different presuppositions as historians, be it historians of the Roman civilizations or historians of science, because if they find out something, they might say that the concept of temperature is completely wrong. And
sorry, Josie, I think Fons just dropped out. He's back. Sorry, yes, he was shortly gone. Yeah, he's back.
So intuitively, I would say, yes, the presuppositions of the history of science are the same presuppositions as what is normally called history, but the presuppositions of science are not the same as the presuppositions of history, be it the history of science or humanistic history, if you see what I mean. So I wasn't quite sure what your claim was. And could you explain what you mean by being a good positivist? Do you mean that all knowledge is historical knowledge? And therefore, or are you saying something like, I just need to understand more.
So being a good positivist, I think that would entail for me, the fundamental idea of positivism is that knowledge is that the fundamental aim of knowledge is empirical adequacy. That you want to say that your beliefs have a degree of empirical adequacy, and that you evaluate your beliefs purely based on their empirical adequacy. I think that's the fundamental idea. And if I say that I'm a good positivist when I do philosophy of history, then that means that, well, I'm going to look at how do historical theories accrue a certain degree of empirical adequacy. So that's what if you're a good positivist, then that's what you look at. And if you do that, I think, well, then the analogies that I draw between the complexities of observation and experimentation in the sciences and the way in which you need to read texts at these analogies, that they're not very weird or strange. And again, I think also part of that is that all knowledge is historical knowledge. I think that's also a fundamental aspect of positivism. Because the success that you ascribe to what experience is and how you progress theories by accumulating experience, that for positivists, this is a historical process itself. That's a more broader claim about positivism. But you find this, for instance, definitely in Ernst Mach. You find this, of course, in Kant as well. So those are two aspects, I think, of positivism. And in a way, I think when I say that I'm a good positivist, I mean these two. The second question, I think, So for me, what I'm trying to say is that if we write a history of science, and if you write a history of science, and if you write a history of historiography, epistemically, they're the same. I want them to be the same, and right. that is, I think, what you don't agree with, right?
No, it's the other one. It's the first thing. So I actually think that, the history of science is a history. And in some ways, it might have, so in the ways in which one has to take a look at the instrument that was used in order to measure the temperature, one does that in the ways in which one might have to look at the ways in which, at the beliefs and so on that people had at a particular moment in time. So I actually, that I don't, but I do find it, on the other hand, what I do think is that I would agree that whatever area of knowledge you are working in, then you want evidence. I mean, that maybe there are some people who don't care about evidence. I don't care about evidence. And I think that, somebody who really defended, for example, the autonomy of historical understanding, like Oakeshott, said that, that the truth is what the evidence obliges to believe. And, in order to, so in a way, we believe to be true what we have evidence of. But what I think that there may be a difference is the kind of evidence with which practicing scientists are working, and on the other hand, historians, be it historians of science and historians of the Roman Empire, are working with, because the latter, historians, be it of science or of civilizations, have to look at, I suppose, cannot be anachronistic, because they have to look at science as it was practiced then, or the laws as they held at that time. And so that there is a very different relationship between a practicing scientist and the history of science, and an historian of science and what scientists taught in the past. Because for practicing science, the history of science might be just wrong. Yeah. Whereas the historians of science is not really concerned with whether those scientific theories were right or wrong, but how they were arrived at, and and what sort of instruments were used in order to. So I think that there are different epistemic goals or desires. I suppose I find that term epistemic desire odd, but presumably that is how it's used in the literature. I would prefer to speak about epistemic goals. But I think that science has a different epistemic goal from the history of science. And the epistemic goal of the history of science is much closer to the epistemic goal of, say, humanistic history than it is to the epistemic goal of science. But, whatever, it was an interesting paper, yeah?
But so let me say something. So I think both. I think you would agree that both the historian of science and a scientist working in some experimental physics lab, that they both have a desire or an aim of empirical adequacy. They both have it. And it is overarching. It's so fundamental for both of them. And of course, they have different aims, in the sense that they want to investigate different subject matters. But the idea that they want to produce their theories by using empirical evidence, this fundamental aim is the same for all of them. And so, yeah. That would be, but that's positivism, right?
Okay, let's shortly move on a bit. Maybe we can return to it. Yes. Okay, let's. I will ask a question now, if possible. This is a very interesting discussion right in the beginning between Avi and then you on the sort of meta-classification of the sciences and the philosophy of the meta-classification of the sciences. I think I would have something to say about that too, but let me first ask a different question about the scope and the validity, or whatever you call it, of the actors principle, the non-anachronism principle. I've forgotten how exactly called it. So from your discussion with David, I understand you're not per se against what we could call general anachronistic redescription of the past, maybe by the redescription of an action of an actor by future consequences which they could not have foreseen, and for want of a nail, the kingdom was lost, or something like that. But then the question is, and I have had the example in my head, there is the discussion whether or not Galileo Galilei in fact had the concept of inertial mass, even though he didn't have it, because otherwise he couldn't have made the inference that he has made, presumably. But then if that is not what is at stake here, then is your principle solely a principle, and solely is not little here, is the principle for the historiography of ideas, so the historiography of and there, because we need to know what or the understand or something like this, or the history of philosophy, because we need to historiography of philosophy. We need to understand what the historical actors actually meant with the text so as to be able to describe it. For that is essential to have this principle. Would that be then? There are many other forms of historiography where this principle is not as relevant. Would that be a proper rendition of it? And then the second part of it would be, you talked about contingent transcendental concepts. I think it's Herzog Chunks. Of course, it's a bit of a interesting formulation. It's contingent and transcendental. So what's the contingent part of it? Is it contingent that we just happen to have found it out now in historically, but actually it's a transcendental principle? Anybody who would want to do historiography, no matter when it was found, would it do it that way? Or is it really contingent in a sense that it is sort of in future, or people would have find very different principles by which they would do their historiography? You understand what I mean?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the contingency is related to the desires or the aims. So desires, it's really my term. So there's a lot of confusion and some unhappiness about the term desire. I like to talk about epistemic desires, but for Chang it's epistemic aims. And so for why are the transcendental principles contingent? Because they are contingent in the sense that they depend on the aims the actors have. And so that's where the contingency comes from. So principles, so this is also how I presented it. So you have certain aims, and these aims are expressed in principles. A principle is an expression of a certain aim that an actor has. And they are contingent because they originate from these aims. That's why they are contingent.
Can I possibly come back? If can I have a finger?
Is it immediate on that? I mean, if it's directly on that, there's a second part of my question too. But if this is immediately on it,
okay, no, go ahead then.
So the first part of your question,
it was on the scope of the principle of non.
The scope of the anachronistic actors principle. Yeah, I'm not fully convinced of like what the scope is, but in the way that I have described it, so there is one there. The scope was, for instance, how Valla uses it. I think is in the scope of the activity of dating texts. I think for dating texts, a version of this principle is definitely fundamental, I would say. Then in intellectual history, I also think that it is fundamental. I mean, and in intellectual history, this is still contentious, right? So you will have intellectual historians who will heavily emphasize the continuity of ideas, who will want to emphasize the continuity of ideas. And of course, I am someone, this might have been very obvious, who thinks that this is completely mistaken, right? Ideas are not continuous between times, and there are fundamental conceptual ruptures in history, and it is the job of the historian, the intellectual historian, to identify these. And so in that sense, the way I've been talking about the anachronistic actors category principle is really, I'm taking sides in the theory of intellectual history here. So I really think that the field, that a fundamental part of the field is to recognize, identify these conceptual ruptures that take place throughout time. So okay. in that sense, but I think there again you see, okay, our desires or our aims, they may be similar, but how we express them may be fundamentally different. And sort of ruptures in a field are often representative of ruptures in ways in which people think about how to express certain aims that a field has. And that's
okay.
That's
before I let Josie make her intervention, she put her finger up, not her hand. Let me just add, because I forgot that before, somebody who has thought very similar about the commonalities between science and historiography before, as you, who even has called reading the Book of Nature taking that nearly literally, this phrase, is Peter Kosso. He has worked on this before. He talks about something which he thinks both of them are hermeneutic in his understanding of hermeneutic. All sciences are hermeneutic. Natural sciences because of the way we use theory, and the hermeneutic circle, that sort of stuff. And I think that would be interesting for you too. And Abi just writes, and Murray Murphy, he wrote in the chat. But he can say it later maybe more. But Josie raised her finger for an intervention, please.
Right, okay, so I hope I remember. So a constitutive principle of understanding the past historically is that we don't commit the sin of anachronism. So we have, what did you call it? What did you call it? Sorry, remember?
Anachronistics actors principle.
Yeah, so we abide by that principle that we don't ascribe to the agents concepts that did not have. It doesn't really matter whether these agents were politicians or scientists. Okay, so we don't ascribe the Egyptians, the belief in germs or something like that. Yeah, it doesn't really matter whether we're dealing with their politics or we're dealing with their science. If we're doing history, and our epistemic desire or goal is understanding them, then we have to abide by that principle, which is constitutive, and there's no metaphysical justification. It's justified by reference to the kind of knowledge that it makes possible or whatever. But if you're doing science, on the other hand, it seems to me that you don't abide by that principle because you're not in the business of understanding, whether the document, what the document said. You're in the business of establishing whether Tutankhamun died because of whatever the bacillus was called, or not. So if the Egyptians thought that he died because his blood was poisoned, they were wrong. It's not like, so in a way, you're adopting a different constitutive principle if you're relating to the past as a scientist rather than a historian of science. And anachronism there is actually not a sin. So the sin of anachronism is a sin in some contexts, but not others, because the presuppositions of science, it seems to me, are, this is not that because science gives us the metaphysical truth, but because its presuppositions are different. So that, I suppose, is my original objection.
Sure.
I accept all the stuff about constitutive principles, but it seems to me that I don't see how you can be a positivist across the board, if you think that the constitutive principles are different. And that doesn't entail you that you sort of you subscribe to some sort of heavy duty metaphysics in order to do that. You can still have the kind of apparatus of the contingent a priori in a way.
So part of the idea here about the constitutive a priori, as I mentioned, is that they are contingent, and they're contingent on the aims of the actors involved. And so different communities can have different aims, and so these different aims will then be expressed in different constitutive principles that will determine fundamentally different epistemic objects. And so, of course, I think as a result, if you are an intellect or a historian of medicine and you're trying to think, okay, how would the Egyptians have thought about the cause of death of Tutankhamun? Well, then you are not going to be doing the same things as a medical practitioner investigating the death of Tutankhamun. You will be doing different things because you're interested in different things, because fundamentally your aims are different. Now comes the question, are your aims in conflict with one another? Well, I don't think so. I don't think there is a fundamental conflict here. You can be interested in, okay, how did the Egyptians think about the death of Tutankhamun? And you can still accept the verdict by the doctor that
absolutely, absolutely.
So there is no, and but the fundamental point here that I'm trying to make is that this way of describing things is in line with what I've presented.
Well, I don't see how that makes you a positivist, because if you are saying that, I mean, presumably, if you're a positivist, you are subscribing to some sort of view about the unity of knowledge. And if one is saying that the historian is now asking different questions from the medical doctor, then it seems to me that you're saying that they're in different epistemic businesses.
Well, no, because they still share one very fundamental aim, namely that they will try to accrue empirical adequacy for their theories. That's still what the historian does. That's still what the medical practitioner does. They will still do this. And so, of course, certain aims will be different. But one of the most fundamental, and for the positivist, this is the fundamental one. We want our theories to have empirical adequacy, and this fundamental one is still the same for all of them. So they are still part of science. They're still doing science, even though some of their aims, of course, are different. But in the hierarchy of aims, there is only one that truly matters, and this is the desire for empirical adequacy.
But what does it mean to achieve empirical adequacy for the historian, for the Egyptologist who studies the historian's beliefs? And what does it mean to achieve empirical adequacy for the doctor? It seems to me that they have very different notions of sort of evidence and adequacy. And it doesn't mean that one is more objective than the other. I'm just saying that they are different. Now, if they're different, to say that there is one overarching epistemic goal in the end becomes rather sort of empty, because when you ask, well, what is that epistemic goal in practice for the historian or intellectual historian, whatever, and for the more scientifically minded person, those are different. So I mean, I'm trying to push you a little bit about this idea that you can be a good positive,
but so good positivist. I'm going to stay with my position and say, but look, no, they are very similar. So the historian will go to the pictorial evidence that is left. He or she will go to the hieroglyphs that are left. He or she will go to some of the later manuscripts and these are material things which this historian will interact with, in the same way that the scientist will interact with certain petri dishes to see, okay, what is I'm going to draw something out of this, and then I'm going to put it in the petri dish, and it will grow, and we'll see. So they are, of course, the type of empirical evidence that they use is different, but that they use empirical evidence is similar.
Well, I'm not sure the semantic content of the hieroglyphs supervenes on the kind of carvings on the wall, but or on whatever. But yeah.
Okay, I think we have
thank you very much.
We have a genuine philosophical problem or question here. How do we weigh similarities and differences between different kinds of sciences? And then we make a judgment whether or not they're in the same business or not. We have heard before talking about difference in object matter. Now we heard about difference in epistemic businesses and so on or not. I think this is an open question itself. But maybe, Fons, do you want to have the last word? I mean, I would have some more questions, but I know we have a few people, and I know it's already 9:30 with you, so I don't want to keep 9:30, right? I don't want to keep you too long. So, Fons, do you wish to say something at the end? You got the last word.
Well, I think it's like the kind of position that I'm trying to develop is difficult. And so I'm really picking up on sort of where where positivism really dropped the ball with Karl Hempel in 1942. It completely dropped the ball, starting with the covering law model of explanation, applying it to historiography. And I am trying to piece together an alternative vision. And so, yeah.
Okay.
And
So maybe
it might succeed, it might not.
So maybe I'll end it by saying maybe your motto is bring back positivism in the philosophy of history. Or maybe it's not.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, then thank you very much, everybody. That was it for today. We'll see you again on the 28th of January next